How's it going, everyone? Welcome, Eulier Gonzalez here. Today, well, let's going to now continue to look at the fundamentals in React as a way to understand now how do we get here, and when you need to explain this stuff to somebody else, we know what's going on. So, not only that, but if you need to describe to JavaScript how to implement now UI using this particular model, which is from React. And when it comes to implement requirements, whether it is for a client, some business, or even for yourself, you have the capacity to describe those requirements into a specification, into a React component. You can now describe as those requirements into user interface in the React way. And this is the idea behind all of these particular frameworks. That given these particular specifications, you can now use any framework, because this is not relevant to React, whether it's Vue, Angular, you name it, right? But given these specifications, once you understand what is the truth of this particular tool, which is React, which is allowing you to create this user interface, okay, you can now is describe in code what it's gonna do. And this is important because the more you need to now implement or bug fix or add some new features to your applications or to the application of another company, the more you will need to describe that, right? The more you, the more you will, the effective way you will need to be effective when it comes to describe why you do the kind of stuff that you need to do and what. So this is the reason why we're starting to look at React, all right? And as a way to make a quick recap of these two models or these two courses, because you have now React, the fundamental of React, as well as the CSS, which is a course. Both of these courses are taught by Josh Komua. So Josh Komua, a software engineering that has previously worked at Khan Academy, as well as the Gatsby, all right? And now, well, he holds this particularly website, as well as their courses, where it actually is telling you now how you can understand the CSS from a JavaScript developers. And what we really care in today's video is the joy of React, or these fundamentals, to actually walk through this and create this storytelling that is compelling and is convenient to learn, because it makes much more sense of that. So we make sense of the world through stories. And this is also something that the people that study communication actually understand, and this is the value that this is why companies are hire them, all right? Because the value that they can when it comes to describe particular stories, right? And not only on marketing or community content managers or community managers, whatever, but that's the idea here. There's also another course here, whimsical animation. Learn how to create charming interaction and delightful touches using the magic of CSS, JavaScript, SVG, and Canvas. This be like another course as well. But yeah. But here we are. Okay. The thing that he mentioned based on this course is that start from CSS and then switch back from React and CSS, so now this interleaving process is something that's gonna give you much more insights, and you can relate where all of this come from. So as a way to make a quick recap, at least of the fundamental of the CSS for JavaScript is to, well, uh, understand prin- the fundamental of the CSS, the anatomy of the CSS, which is what is CSS, how you can add styles, whether it's external style sheets, internals, or inline. Also, you can select elements on the DOM to apply the rules, whether it's using via class or tag or attributes, or pseudo elements or pseudo classes, whether it's the selectors or via state base, which is using these pseudo selectors or pseudo elements, okay, as well as the combinators. So if you want to cherry picking that particular tag or collections of tag, you can use this combinator. For example, the direct descendant or the next to sibling as well. And then some of the part of the CSS anatomy, which is the functions, which you have now the math, the yeah, exactly, math, translate, RGB, HSL, cramp, among other functions, right? And the add rule that indicate how CSS should behave to apply a certain rules. So for example, like layers or the keyframe or media queries, also the property shorthand and the comment. So all of this is just to understand is the fundamentals, the anatomy of the CSS, all right? And when you need to now be more relevant, because all of this is like anthropology, history, all right? That is need to be, that you need to know. But when it comes to be more precise, realistic of what the industry actually needs you to know, we also look at the basic stuff that are now part of the industry, the relevant stuff that we need to know still in 2025, which is, well, what is a CSS rule? All right. So what is a rule? What is a selector, a declaration, a unit, and also the media query. Why do we even care about media queries? As well as the selectors, the most common selector, despite that we have all others, this modern tooling that are useful. So for example, like the hover. So not only the selectors by tag, ID, and class, but also is the other one, which is the pseudo selectors, like the hover, the focus, the check, the first and last child, and first and type or last and type. What is the difference of that? Why do we even care about this pseudo selector, specifically the focus? Because this is part of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, right? That follow is this four principles, which is perceivable. Is four principles. It's perceivable, it's operable, it's understandable, and it is robust. Okay. So this is a set of guidelines for provide accessibility to your web applications, all right? And, all right, also other pseudo elements, for example, like after and before, which is heavily used for decoration, and then you have now the placeholders. Also, the color or the combinators of selectors, as I mentioned before, the descending, directing, so yada yada yada. The color, which is a huge topic in itself, but we summarize this into 4 color formats: keywords, hexadecimal, RGB, and HSL. And why we even care more about HSL? Because it's way much more intuitive when it comes to pick a color. Okay. Also the unit, M, root M, and percentage, which is something that we're gonna heavily use on aspect ratio and calculate the height. All right. The other is the typography, okay, which is, well, to get ourselves familiar with this basic context. Font family, why we even care about font family, what are the types of uh, fonts that we can have, whether it is the serif or sans serif, uh, why do we, what is web fonts, why do we even care about web fonts, and then the type of formatting text, whether it's bold or italic, the underline in some specific semantics, for example, like emmed, that kind of stuff, and also is the text formatting, text transformation, and text spacing. All of this is just the fundamental of the CSS that we must know, we must be aware of that, all right? So knowing the declaration of a CSS, so knowing what is a CSS rule, the media query, the selectors, pseudo elements and pseudo classes, and the most common of that, the combinators, the color, the units, as well as the typography. So with that mindset, all right, then now we can explore of the joy of React, which is we all start here by understanding what is the problem or when it comes from. And I'm gonna make a quick recap of this, okay? Because this is a problem that Facebook needs to solve when some users were complaining about that they're building a particular feature, all right, where they need to when showing them is a message, so I can show you here. So when a message or a notification is shown in their message, so when the user click there is no new message, and this is something that is happened recurrently in their app. So imagine that you are in Facebook and you have to deal with these particular problems as well as all of these problems that arise, plus adding new features, right? So it is basically like playing whack-a-mole with all of this. So this particular problem arise again, so you have all of this issue here and again and again. So there was now an experimental tool called React, and this is also why do we need to dive deep into this concept of llama, all right, or llama, okay, especially for exploring that. But again, this is go beyond the scope of today's video, because this is the next, not experimental, but now this open source tool that becomes widely popular to actually adopt when it comes to training your large language model, all right? But in any case, that's something that go beyond the scope. I mentioned this because this particular tools that initially was developed internally to help their problems now become widely available, and this is why we are actually looking at that. So React solve this particular problem that they have to say, hey, let's go to now keep the state and the user interface in sync, all right? So because of that, now we have the ability to use that particular library, the React API surface we can have access to, and render those user elements and keep the state sync with all of them, all right? Regardless the platform that we're using for. So not only for the web, but also for the mobile, as well as for the web LG to render 3, and each one of those platforms has its own particular primitive. similar to the JavaScript, when you have now this primitive, all right? Here on the web we have particularly primitive, div, inputs, buttons. The mobile with React Native has another primitive, all right? Like text, input, I mean, is text, is view, text, pressable, and now the React 3 Fiber comes with another primitive, which is now lightness. I'm not quite familiar with that, I'll be honest, but it's lights, geometry, material, and camera. So this is something important to know, all right? And here they're describing is what the heck is a DOM, something that I'm quite familiar with. I'm not gonna dive deep. Most of us know what it is. And how can we create is our own now React application. And why this is important, because here we're gonna see that at the end of the day, React is actually using is the document API. So React, you can think of React as a lightweight wrapper around the DOM, okay? Because you can now create elements, and those elements that you are creating, all right? Now you're gonna pass is the particularity tag that you want to pass to. You can even pass any tag that you want to. You pass a particularity tag, you pass the props, all right? The attributes here, and the second and the third argument you're gonna pass is now the content of that particularity primitive, aka HTML tag, all right? And how once you now create that, React behind the scene is going to create now an object that has all of this information, okay, available, so it knows behind the scene is the state of the applications, and therefore is going to now mount that component or mount that function that holds is this element, create React elements into the DOM, all right? So all of this is very interesting because we're starting to create our own React behind the scenes. We understand that at the end of the day, React is this React create element, all right? And then as we move down to this, because it is quite tedious, it is quickly tedious to write all of this React create elements anytime you define is a tag in HTML. There is now a particularly format or language, markup language, to actually make our life much more easy to describe is the user interface, combining with JavaScript. So, which is GSX. So we look at what is GSX, which is just this markup that is transpiling to JavaScript, and the difference between transpiling and compiler is that transpiling is from one high-level language to another, so from Python to Java to JavaScript, and so on and so forth. And in our case is transpilation, and the other is compilation, which is transforming this high-level program set of instructions into a machine code. We can use now compilations indiscriminately with transpilation, but we know what we meant to. So this GSX, which now is this markup that allow us is to inject is so that allows to describe HTML and then inject JavaScript expressions here. And JavaScript expressions are anything that produce a value, all right? One of the powerful stuff of this is that by doing that, all right, we can now pass dynamic data to this. So GSX, I would call this as GSX expressions, all right? and we need to understand what is the difference between an expression and a statement. This is something that goes beyond the scope of today's video, but this is part of the JavaScript. The TLDR is that expression is something that produces a value, and a statement is a call to action. All right. So, for example, when you define a variable, when you iterate through a loop, or even when you are defining is an expression, that is a statement. Okay. So the point of this is to be able to understand that, as well as how you can now create is or the nuance of this markup language. So for example, how you can comment in GSX, how you can pass attributes to that. What is important that remember that at the end of the day, these GSX expressions are actually now doing the coercion because it's using JavaScript behind the scenes. And when it comes to compare now GSX with HTML, okay, we look at that. Well, GSX now first in terms of the reserved word that it has. So for example, the HTML4 for labels, or the class name as the attribute for your elements. Okay, it is case sensitive to tag as well as the attributes. All right, it's case sensitive, and there's some nuance in there. And what I mean that is case sensitive and for attributes is that it has now a particular format, which is camel case, except for the area, and which is for accessibility and for data tag, useful for testing. So we also look at the way of how we can now add these inline styles, which is at the end of the day, you are passing is now an object, you are creating an object to that. All right, and how you can now actually makes much more sense with the GSX in itself. Some gotchas with the, for example, white space, and when you add now a white space, what is actually this is compiling to or transpiling to. All right. So remember that at the end of the day, you are now is creating is any time that you make a tag, you're creating an element, a React create element. You're invoking that. So this is pretty much the same when you are now invoking a white space. And a white space is something that is used as a way to provide now is well, this additional space in your text. We also look at some exercise and how can we create our own search bar, which might be silly, very, very silly, all right? But it's also a way of how you can actually is understand that what is doing behind the scenes, this transpilation, all right, which is just transforming that into a React create element, all right, where the first attribute is a tag, the second is the props, all right, and the third is the content. Okay, so because of that, okay, we look at specific ways of how you can now modify is the props or the attributes of your tag elements, all right, in a way that it makes, or in a way that aligns to this particularly mental model, which is anytime that you create a particularly GSX in React, what it's doing behind the scenes is creating now a React element for that. Okay, again, the detail here is the devil, quote quote, is on the detail, and I mention this because Exactly. I mentioned this because so we know what's going on behind the scenes. And anytime that you are creating now any of these tags, so the more HTML tags that you use to try to describe that, um, it will have an impact on the elements that React needs to not only create but also to keep track of. All right. So this is when all of this optimization start to begin. All right. Because a lot of people are actually out there are writing a lot of tags or a lot of fonts and yada yada yada. But the thing is that the less is better. The less is better. So we also look at the difference between now the templating or the template language with GSX. They are not the same. Definitely they are not the same, because GSX, what it does is to transpile to JavaScript and let the logic be handled by the language. Whereas on a template engine, you have to, if you think about it, you have to create, well, your own pseudo language to actually handle that particular logic. To verify that, when you want to show or not a particular element, for example, like if or another template engine, or for loops, all right, iterations of collections, right? So this is one of the beautiful stuff, as well as GSX, where it allows you to describe this markup language, and each one of those tags create now a React element that the more React elements, or the more, aka the more tag that you have, the less performant your application can be. Okay? Because at the end of the day, create now an object that internally is now handling is the state of your application. Okay? So a thing to keep in mind, especially when you want to now create your user interface, or if somebody's telling you that, hey, uh, we have a problem here, we have a performance optimization, what can we do? All right, what can we do? So I think that's something that's great. That's great to know that. So once we went through this, to understand the magic of React, a little bit of history of React, and then uh, how can we create our own React components, or React, what is doing behind React, and why React is so terrific to use, because it allows you to now describe all of this user interface in different platforms, which is a great stuff. And also you can now is uh, understand uh, what React is doing behind the scenes, and why we need to use the GSX, and what is the value proposition of GSX, what is GSX, how GSX works, what are the subtle details that we need to know about GSX, whether it's such as, well, how do you set the attributes, yeah, how do you set the attributes, like how you comment on that, how you pass data to that, how you inject that data. And now the difference between the GSS with HTML in terms of resource keyword, the uh, the case sensitive of tags, as well as for attributes would have a particularly camel case. What are the nuance in those cases? So area and data are not part of them. Also, the uh, ways of how you can inject that, for example, with styles. all right? And well, some exercise to get yourself familiar to this, to understand what's going on behind the scenes, as well as the GSX, the different now, not only with HTML, but now is with the template engine. And finally is this notion of the components, which is the TLDR is that in any other component, in any, so the web development traditionally has been is a separation of concerns on per files. So you have now the structure, you have the style, and you have now the functionality, right? But now the components, because Facebook's now solved this particular problem, it makes much more sense to now is blending into particularly user interface, right? So given that particular user interface, you have now is the structure, the style, and the logic, all right? And not only that, but also that what are the mechanisms of reusable this, okay? Because traditionally in HTML there is no way to reuse chunks of markup. Many languages use something called known as partial. I am not familiar with this, all right? I am not familiar of this partial HTML, okay, in a static web as component, but it's partial. Partial in HTML refers to reusable fragments of HTML code that can be included in multiple pages. Okay, they are now, but by default, all right, by default, this reusable mechanism, all right, HTML doesn't have that natively. So some language, or even ourselves, have this things called partial, okay? The other reusable mechanism in CSS we have now is the class, okay? Where the point of this is the way of how you can reuse a particular set of rule, a particular appearance or layout in your UI, all right? Whereas in JavaScript, we have now functions to reuse logic. Here in React, as well as any other component-based library, the way of how can we now reuse this user interface, all right, is through components or JavaScript functions, at least in the case of the React, okay, as well as Vue, as well as Angular, and as well, yada yada yada, right? That is their reusable mechanism. So, because not only that we can have, we have, or we can, how do I put it? Because we have now is the ability to reuse components, all right, in JavaScript or in these component-based libraries, but also it needs to reuse is the logic. And this is important of why do we need to understand these basics, these fundamentals, so we can dive deep into them. So, what does it mean that? Well, that when it comes to reuse logic in our components, remember that the whole point of this React is that we have now the user interface and the state, okay? And we want to keep them sync. So we're looking now is what are the mechanisms of how can we reuse UI via components and reuse state or logic via is custom hooks or hooks, right? This is something that you're gonna see a lot of in any component frame a lot of any component-based frameworks, uh, that they are doing all the same. All right. Perhaps the way how they do is different, but the end result is the same. So, uh, this is one of the reasons why I love to explore about the component here, from this from the file based perspective as well as for the component base, and also is what are now those reusable mechanisms, which is something that we as engineering and as like grandma or somebody that live on the street actually is looking always for. How can I reuse it? How can I reuse it? How can I reuse it? And so on and so forth. So now the basic syntax. Okay, the basic syntax of this component. Well, at the end of the day, it's just a function that you can create. All right. I'll prefer to use this now, export default functions, because for debugability purpose, just for that. There is an arrow and traditional functions. Okay, the main reason why I'm using is traditional function is because of that. And the big component rule, that is the name component must start with capital letters. All right. Yeah, something that we are quite familiar with. But again, when you're starting to develop, it's become a second nature here. So okay, we look now at the syntax. We also look at the props, as well as the children props, and a particular exercise for that. But again, all of this is just to understand now the component. Okay, so thinking in component, the basic syntax, the props, which is the way of how you can actually is now pass down data, and how we now the structuring is our data via this component. That if you think about this, the way how we are now receiving that data, or these default values, all right, exactly like props, the way how we now receive those values, which is something that I don't think we mentioned that. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. No. Mm-mm-mm. Mm-mm-mm. Oh, okay, exactly. Because at the end of the day, this is to illustrate that. All right, this is to illustrate that. This is to illustrate that. This is to illustrate that. All right, completely. This is to illustrate that. When it comes to props, is that how do we know that we're passing is props to that? Because at the end of the day, when you are now creating is an element, using the React Create, all right, behind the scenes, all right, what it's doing is that, or when you're defining is an element here, with that React Create, with the React Create, the first parameter you pass is the yeah, because the question is that how do we now get these parameters? You know, how does it make sense that we now get these parameters here? All right, how do we actually get access to this parameter? Well, because when you're defining is the React element, your first pass is the tag, all right, or the component in itself, which is now a function, all right. You pass now a function here, and I think this is a very good example of what's going on. And don't tell me that I closed that. Oh my fucking brave. You got it. And there you go. All right. Yeah, because the idea of this, all right, is to truly understand that, and I really love this particular example here, is this. Okay. Here, because now we are, the structuring is this. If we want to render dynamic data, we can use props. Here we're going to use object structuring, and here we're describing is what object structuring it is. Pa, 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 pa. However, okay, but how props are passed to our component? Okay, and this is a very valid question and a very interesting one. Okay, so they are passed now, and I want to highlight here, and I want to highlight this thing here. Let me actually highlight this. Okay, since any time we are creating a tag, or in our case a component, we behind the scenes, exact components in GSX, behind the scenes, what it's doing, exactly behind the scenes, what it's doing is, okay, so behind the scenes what it's doing is describing an React element, okay, like for example, okay, is creating is describing a React element, okay, is describing a React element, for example here, that contains is not only a tag but a function, okay, but a function that describe is the UI, and as the first parameter, and the second argument, I don't want to make that intense. Yeah, it's like too intense. Gonna make that more. Yeah, I prefer that color. Yep. I don't want to be that too invasive. It's like this. That's right. So that contain is not only a tag but a function that describe the UI as a first parameter, and the second argument is the props. Exactly. The second argument is the props, and the third is the content. All right. So when now React execute, when JavaScript execute that, all right, you can also even console.log that, all right. You can also even console.log that. You can even think about that. Again, that piece of code won't work. Okay, that piece of code won't work, but when JavaScript executes that, it creates an object, okay, an object that contains is all the data that it needs, okay. And that's why we jumped into the children props. And the children props is a property that exists in all HTML elements, which is great, but also is the way how you can now is pass down data to this. All right. So you can think of the children props as the content, which is actually the content that you can now extract from the component in React, because that's the magic behind the scenes of React, quote quote magic. All right, is a property that React is passing to the function behind the scenes, okay, to get that, and then and allow you to render is all of the content that you pass inside of that, or in other words, any of the content that is in between those component, or that opening and closing tag. That's mind blowing, bro. That's mind blowing, bro. Absolutely. So the thing here is that it all makes sense, especially when you know what's going on here. What is this? Holy moly. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Absolutely. When we do this, we can access the children through the children prop. Interesting. Exactly. And what the children is to say, hey, the pattern component of this is now giving you these children props that any content that you render between those tags is gonna allow you to re-render in your component as well. All right, that's what it's doing with these children here. Is you saying, okay, I want to now any content that I'm receiving from the parent, all right, I want to now is render that is. So you can now is say, hey, let's go into now leave the components up, and in there render that content, which is an optimization techniques. All right, you avoid to create is another component, therefore you create now that, and then you render that content in there. That makes a lot of sense. So you save yourself tags here and components, and in other words is React objects that needs to be tracked of by the language. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Holy moly. Holy moly. Holy moly. Okay. Oh, okay. All right. All right. Absolutely. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Okay. The children props. Good. 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 Children is a special value in the reserved word. That is. So what happens if you pass both forms of the children props? All right. Well, React, okay, now make that particular decision of rent or give privilege to anything that is passing not as the children in the HTML tag, but as the content in itself. So you can think again is a structure of how it's going to create it. And then we look at particularly CRM, where we need to actually create that particularly component, so on and so forth. And then we jump into the application structures. All right, here we go. Let's get into this, fellas. Let's get into this. Let's definitely get into this. Okay, now things are starting to make a lot of sense here. Mm-hmm. 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 All right. All right. Good. Let me drink a little bit of water. All right. Good. Makes sense. Makes sense. Makes sense. Okay. Okay. Now the application structure. So no matter how big or small, most React applications will share a common structure. Here's an example of this structure, and take a few moments to poke around and see how everything works. So, here we are defining is the React. We already import that. We are defining is the entry point to create the root, all right, from the React, from this library, and it say, hey, this is now the component of our app that is now a GSX element, exactly, that is now converted this GSX element into a React create element, where the app is the first parameter here that we're gonna exactly. This is translate into a GSX, which is the React create element, where the first element is the app as a function, all right. The second argument here, we're not passing any props to this. There's no defined props here, all right. So we're not defining any props here. Only a something, but a children as a header. All right, we're defining is this element, which is creating is this a React element as a fragment here, and then inside of that React element, we have is the div. We have the props that we're not passing any props to that, and also we have is the children that has now these two elements here. Okay, it has now a header, where now this header is a component, which is a function, which is when you convert this into a JavaScript, from GSX into JavaScript, it say, hey, this will be now is the React create elements header as a tag or as a function, followed by the props, as well as the the children, where in our case it doesn't have any. Okay. And then you're going to create another element with the main tag in this case, with no property, but the children has now another create element as a p tag that doesn't have any props, but their content is a typical app structure here. So once that React create element of function has been defined, okay, it say, let me now create the root, all right. And when it comes to say create the root, let me put it, charge this. Okay. And when it say, let me now create the root here, to say, hey, somehow it's passing now this document query selector dot root, all right, where this is creating now a function or an object, perhaps is creating now an object that it say, hey, I'm going to invoke now the render function with this structure that I mentioned before with the app, right? All of these React create elements, and it is props in the function or the tag, and the props and the children, right? I'm just gonna put it this way. The app, which is create React element, okay, here this will be something like this. Say, hey, React create element, okay, that now this will be the function that we're going to inject, which is the app, I gotta do this as a way to inject this app, the props, as well as the content, where the content of this is made of a several other element here. Okay, which is made of several other elements, where you have now this, where you specify now is this, here the fragment. Okay, we can call this as fragment. Okay, which might be a internal component that you can have, no props, but you also have now is another collection of elements here. Another collection of elements here. That is, well, the header component. Okay, that again, it doesn't have any components, any props, but it contains is more React elements, right? It contains more React element, which is the diff, the header, exactly, the header and the main. So the header, where now the header will contain is the header tag, which contains the header tag. There is no props there, and inside of that has another element as a children here, that say this is the main. Let's say this is the main. I mean the H1 example app. So it creates a new tag, which is an H1. All right. That doesn't have any props right now, and the content is in this, right? Example app. This is the end of that particular component, right? And also this header only have that, exactly, the header only have that, okay, but the header in itself, or at the fragment level, you also have now another component that is being created, which is, you have another component that is being created, which is this main tag, right? This main tag. Let me put it this way to differentiate that. Okay. And this main tag is similar for this. Okay, similar for this. And this main, which is inside of the fragment, here's the app, okay, it has now a main and a P that has been created. It has now a main with no attributes, all right, and inside of this it has now a P tag that is being created. Okay, with the content of typical app structure. And that'll be all. So all of this GSX, as you can see here, is this JavaScript code, as you can see here, which is generating when you now transpile this GSX into JavaScript, which is what it's doing here is passing that. What it's doing here is like you're passing is this, all right? Is the same. In fact, they're supposed to render the same way, right? Fragment is not defined. Oh, but it's evaluating. So you can say something like this, like fragment or a diff, you know. It's gonna put it this way like this, but there's supposed to be a fragment for that. So this is the equivalent, bro. Header is not defined. You're right, because header is defined inside of that. You can say is import header from the component. This is one of the reasons why I prefer alias header. Okay, so this is the equivalent to say this. It is the equivalent. It is the equivalent. Example app, typical app structure. Nothing has changed, bro. Nothing has changed. You know? Nothing has changed, bro. And when you are able to see the matrix here and understand how these actually things work, all right? I think if we pass something like this, it will render that. Exactly. Good. Much better. Much aligned. Much aligned. Much more aligned. That's profound, bro. That's profound, bro. That's profound. Application structure here. Application structure here. Okay. Application structure here. This the commented code is just the equivalent to use React without the GSX. Okay? In this example, which is what it's doing here, let's break down these files. So you have now the index, the app, and the header. All right. So we have now the index, the apps, and the models. Okay, the root index.js is typically the first bit of code which will be executed. It is responsible for rendering a React application, turning the React elements we write into live DOM nodes. In general, there will only be one spot in the entire code base that calls the create root and renders method from React DOM. While it is possible to have multiple application roots, this is generally only done when progressively migrating to React from another framework or technology stack. Okay, when you want to render, it's different there. It's common to do setup tests in this file as well. For example, this file is a good place to import global CSS or set up any error logging services on the index. Exactly. So because index.js is more of a setup file than an active part of the application, we don't typically want to render a bunch of JSX here. It will be weird to include headers and buttons and footer here. That stuff happened in the app, and we're still setting up the app here. Aside from some provider components later in this course, these files generally only renders a single element app. So this is a typical, okay, the index. This is, so this the first bit of code will which execute. Okay, it is responsible for rendering our React application during the React element we write into them. Exactly. It is responsible for rendering React applications for rendering our React application and turning React elements, exactly, turning React elements into live DOM. Okay, which is once it's evaluate the entire structure that I mentioned before, is going to now create those objects, and internally is going to perhaps doing the virtual DOM, right, where it has now an internal representation of the virtual DOM as an object in JavaScript. All right. And any time that those components change, it will automatically update that. That's powerful. That's powerful because now with this React create element here, is that is responsible for actually is updating that. So when there is a change in that component, it will cause a re-render. In other words, it will cause now a re-evaluation of all of these components, of all of those React components, of all of those subsequent React elements here. Now it makes a lot of sense why this thing actually does the way it does, bro. So the index file is when we're rendering the React application and turning React elements into live DOM. Okay. In general, there will only be one spot. In general, there will be only one spot. Okay. Exactly. There will be only one spot in the entire code base. Okay. One spot in the entire code base. Okay. In the entire code base. Okay. In the entire code base, bro. that calls the create root and render method. That calls the create root in the entire document. They said that calls the create root. It calls the create root in that calls the create root. So in general, there will be only one spot in the entire code base there will be only one spot in the entire code base that calls the create root. That calls the create root from the React DOM, the render. While it is possible to have multiple application root, well, it is possible to have multiple applications. It's possible to have multiple application roots, but this is generally only done when progressively migrating to React from another framework or technology stack. This is done only. This is generally only done when migrating to React from another tech stack. There will be only one spot in the entire code base. So you can think here as the index as the setup file. It is common to do setup task here. Exactly. So it is common to do setup task here, okay, in this file as well. In this file. So for example, it's a good place to import global CSS or any error logging services. Exactly. So for example, importing CSS error logging services via error boundary. Because the index.js is more like a set of file than an active part of the application. We don't want to typically wants to render a bunch of JSX. We don't typically want to render exactly. So because index.js is more like a setup file, we don't want to render multiple JSX. That's the place for that. It will be weird to include header and bottom and footer here. That stuff happens in the app where we're still setting up the app here. Aside from some provider components, this file generally only render a single element. But for example, if you are here in the app, but it's not showing is the index here. Exactly. Only for provider components. Because index is more like a set of file. We don't want to render multiple GSX elements here. This file generally only renders a single element. This file only generally renders a single element, the app, which is the entry point of our application. And then we look at the app here. It is common for a project to have a common call app, short for application. This is the home-based React component in our project. The component that is an ancestor to every other component. Pick a random component in the React app and you should be able to trace its lineage to app. This component will sometimes manage core layout stuff like headers and footers. Layout stuff like headers and footers. In smaller applications like the Hello World, one shows here we are rendering additional UI in this component. In smaller applications like Hello World, one show here we are rendering additional UIs in this component, though we tend to not see as much as the application grow in size. If you're using a routing solution like React Router or top-level routes are often included in this file. Every project is different, and there are no hard rules for how to structure this component. The important thing is that app should show developers how the application is structured. It is a home base for developers to check, to get acquaintance with how things work. All right. But again, this is the home base. So this is the home base. In my case, like a setup file. So this is the home base, all right, of the React component in our project. Of the React component in our project. The component that is ancestors to every other component. Exactly, the component that is an ancestor of any other components. Pick a random component in React app and you should be able to trace its lineage to app. This component will sometimes manage core layout stuff. Okay. And okay. So this component will also manage some layout component, layout based components, routing solutions, or any other component or any other React component that needs to share data. And we generally use ES model system to split our application into multiple files. If you're not familiar with this import and export syntax, you can learn more about this in the JavaScript lessons from that, which is something that I'm quite familiar with. Basic premise, name export. The significant number is 5. Export statement, quick primer, renaming import. We can rename import with the as keyword, exactly, and default import. When it comes to default export, we always export an expression here. Exactly, we always export an expression. Every JavaScript model is limited to a single export default. For example, this is invalid. When importing default export, we don't use squiggly bracket. Okay, import magic number from data, incorrect from this. So when we are importing a default export, we can name it whatever we want. It doesn't have to match. This work, import magic number from data. This also works. Import hello from the data. A lot of this difference might seem arbitrary or confusing. But all of things from this fact, every model can have multiple name export, but only a single default export. Yep. When to use which? Now that we covered the fundamental about name and default export, you might be wondering when should I use each one of these types. In fact, this question with no objectively correct answer. It all comes down to picking a convention that works for you. For example, let's say we have a file that holds a bunch of these constants, color and size and fonts. We could structure it like this: export default, or we can use the name export like this: export name. All right, theme, color, space and fonts, or like this: color, space and fonts. We can use a single group default export and a lot of individual name export. Both of these options are perfectly valid. Here's a convention I like to follow. If a file has one big main thing, it make it the default export. I make it the default export. Secondary things like helpers and metadata can be exported using name export. For example, a component might be set up like this, where this is the default help, exactly, the header, all right? The header here. Come on, bro. The header here. Or models, which is how all components are organized. This is how we split our JavaScript file or application into multiple files. Split our app into multiple files using the ex6 model syntax. And then going forward, I want to share this quick lesson on application structure because we'll be using it in many of the sandboxes in this course. Going forward, for example, you might see something like this, which means that this is the index is the setup function where you are now take care of loading or rendering the application. In other words, is to convert those JSX elements into React elements and therefore now into an object that React is going to create those live nodes, all right, and keep track of that, and keep track of those live nodes, bro. So here what we're doing is creating React create element with this fancy button, which is fancy function without any props, and the children is click me. All right. And because this fancy button is creating now a GSX element, which is the button in itself, that the props has now this style. Okay, and it's gonna render that children. So when you click here, you can actually render that. To keep things focused and minimal, we aren't showing the index with the create root and render calls. Whatever is not shown, you can assume it is rendering the app component. There will be also some minimal style, including convertly, in some of the sandboxes. If you're curious about how certain style works, you can always inspect them in the browser dev tool. Okay? But at the end of the day, if you want to render now this, right? Say console log of the fancy button. This is now a function. That's right. It say, hey, this is a function. If you execute that function, it say, hey, I cannot execute that. Error in the sandbox. Children of undefined as it is undefined. So in other words, you can say is to say, well, React create element. All right. I think it's gonna complain about it. Because it doesn't have any React reference. Exactly. Say, hey, import React from or you say just simple React. And this is exactly what it's doing. Right. So it creates now this object, which has the type, the key, and the props. All right. That now say, hey, this is the function. This function has the data here, and this is a function. Okay. And behind the scenes, it doesn't expect anything, only the style object here. So only the style object. So you pass how near a style, you say style with this, and this is exactly what it's doing behind the scenes. So inside of the props, it has now a style that we're passing, okay? But this is the object that now React is creating for, okay? This is the object that React is creating for. So, however, because this style is not applicable to this object, okay, since we are not passing any props to that, and in fact is the content only called click me, but this, the reality is that we are now creating is another element here, which in that case is the button, and it's inside of the button, which is button, we are indeed now passing is a property here, like this. You say, hey, this is now this style. The style here is this. We can get rid of the additional data that we don't need. Okay. And we can do something like this. All right. All right. Plus the another property here, which is the click me. No, say click me. This is exactly the structure that we are actually passing through that. You know? This is what it is, man. And it is rendered as it is. The type of a function, the key and props, and inside of the props we're passing now a children. This is the object that is generated in React for us. So if we say, for example, this, and then we pass to that, all right, we say, hey, I want to export now whatever app is. Just in this case, let me now save this here. You can say app cons app. I want to store this. All right. In the strict mode component, consider adding error boundaries to your tree and customize error handling behavior. So if you go to the result, it says this is a fancy button. Do you accidentally export GSX literally instead of a component? Element type is invalid, expected as a string for building component. Oh, okay. Another thing is that you can say something like this. Hey, I want you to render this as a div. Right? Or adding this. Did you accidentally export GSX literal instead of a component? GSX literal instead of a component, which is this. But this is what happening behind the scenes. I just want to do this as a way to recap what's going on there. Okay. Fragments. Let's suppose we want to wind up with the following HTML. Wind up. It says, welcome to my homepage. Don't forget to sign the guestbook, we copy paste this HTML into React application, turning into a JSX. We went up getting an error though. Here. This is now restore. Exactly. The error message is telling us the JSX to use a JSX fragment. And we'll learn all about that shortly. But first, let's take a moment and think about it. Why does this produce an error? Spend a couple minutes thinking of this problem. Well, it's produced an error because it's the way how this is being created. And this is not a valid way of defining is a UI element in a composition way. Okay? That's what it's telling you. That's what you always need to pass is this single root element here. Mm-hmm. So how can we fix it? One option is to wrap both elements in a div. If you do this, if you do both elements into a div or in a fragment, remember that at the end of the day, this is if you want to show content like this, you are now adding is a new elements there, a new React element here. So you gotta be careful when you do that, right? So this fixes the syntax error, but not really ideal. It pollutes the DOM with unnecessary elements and can even lead to accessibility and layout issues like this. So you have your list of items, all right, that is now rendering elements like this. In this example, is rendering is item 1 and 2 properly, but it give okay. The element 1 and 2 are rendering properly, and because of this now are in this example the list items are meant to be displayed in a single row, but the div breaks the flexbox algorithm. Holy hell. It also produces invalid markup. I don't even know if this anyway. It also produces invalid markup, which means that it might cause problems for folks who rely on assistive technology like screen readers. Fortunately, there are better ways we can use. We can use Fragment. A fragment is a special React component that does not produce a DOM node, and it looks like this. If we inspect the output in our developer tools, we see that our two HTML, H1 and HP sits inside the container element div ID root. Fragment allows us to respect the rules of JavaScript without polluting the HTML, and they are a great option. And then we have now the shorthand here. Okay. Fragments. So we got now is the fragment. Okay. So the TLDR is that fragment is that allowing us to avoid polluting the DOM, polluting the DOM. Exactly. The React team includes a suspension component specifically to allow us to return multiple elements from a component without polluting the DOM. It is a great tool. So allowing us to avoid polluting the DOM with extra tags. All right. So for example, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. With extra tags. So if we inspect the output node developer tools, we get now this. So which is a great option. And then you have now the shorthand. And then you have now a shorthand here. Alright. So React Fragment can also be created using the following syntax. Either where the GSS compiled to exactly the same JavaScript code, which is that. And here is go the children's. Mm-hmm. And then we look now at the iteration. In the recent exercise, building a serial, and we extract a contact card component and use it in our 3 components, right? These solutions work, but there is a potential issue with it. We won't always have the data when we write the code. In building CRM software, the data will be dynamic, and every user will have a separate set of contacts, and those contacts will change at a time. We can hardcore 3 random contacts like this. In React, we typically solve this problem using iteration. We dynamically create these React elements by using raw, unadulterated JavaScript. So iteration. Vamos a seguir. Basta ahí. Okay. So anytime we want to describe dynamically, data, okay? Anytime we want to describe dynamically data, is that anytime we want to describe dynamically data to be shown, we can use we can iterate to those elements. Exactly. When we don't have always the data, mm-hmm. when we don't have always the data that we write the code, and we need to show dynamic data in React, we typically solve this problem by using iteration. We dynamically create these elements by using raw unadulterated JavaScript code. So mapping over data, key and exercise. Which is something that I'm quite familiar with. In other frameworks like Vue and Angular, special syntax is provided for doing iteration. In React, however, we purely rely on JavaScript. There is no React syntax for doing this sort of iteration. If you're feeling adventurous, spend a few minutes and see if you can figure out how to solve this problem. If it is okay, if you're not sure, experiment to see what happens. This is the best way. So you can use this as a map, but again, it's this. So one of the reasons of this mapping over data, you don't have a special syntax here. Mapping over data, unlike Angular or Vue, where they have any specific way to iterate through data, to render data, collections of data. To provide iteration, all right, whether it's before or directive. Here in JavaScript, we can reuse is the JavaScript methods to do that. For example, mapping in arrays. And there is no React syntax for doing this sort of iteration. If you're feeling adventurous, you can do this, array in iteration, and the particular approach of here. So thing here, we're starting to sweep.
People, when they start using React and they learn that React actually doesn't offer any sort of built-in way though, and elements. And so because I have an entire lesson about map, I'm not going to go over it here. Warning. Don't worry about this for now. We're going to talk about it in the next couple. JavaScript language is we can do anything that we would do in JavaScript. Like let's say I wanted to omit the first person, right? Only show the second person onwards. Well, I can do that with the slice method, where I slice everything from the first one onward, and now we see the two cards that remain. I don't have to worry about figuring out what the Vue syntax is for slice. I can use the JavaScript that I already know.
Exactly. That's a pretty common tactical gotcha here. Consider the following code. Instead of using parentheses, we can use we're using a squiggly bracket here. It seems like a pretty inequitous change, but it causes a big problem here. None of the contact card will show up. Here's what is going on, because here you're telling is that it's evaluating this. You're not returning that. In order for the contact card elements to be rendered, they need to be returned from the map callback. You can fix this by actually say is a return to this. This is a long form way of writing arrow in functions. This wiggly bracket gives us this special one here. GSX inside JavaScript inside GSX. Okay. So you're gonna leave that for today's video. That'll be all. Take care. Bye bye.